Welcome to Chapter 2 of Glamador's Sprite Modification Tutorial videos. In this video, we're going to go over how to do a more complex modification than the simple recolor we did in Chapter 1. It's going to be a redo of an old mod of mine, requested by Blanix the Blood, which puts this cute little met tool from Mega Man into the spot of the RX-78 Landrunner for gunner and female gunner. Now, the first step you're going to want to take when using a completely foreign source with a sprite map is open up your image editor. In this case, we're going to be using paint.net. And then open up your sprite map in your editor. Now, to start off with, let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see what we're doing. We're going to want to select the Magic Wand tool over here. What the Magic Wand tool does, it selects everything of a similar nature to where you click. So click over here anywhere in the white space, and then just hit the delete key on your computer keyboard. That gets rid of all the white space. What we're going to want to do after that is to decide which of these sprites best fits with the RX-78 Landrunner that we're going to be replacing. So let's open up the Dnf Extractor. Now, I've already got this loaded up from before when I was working on this before the video, but just to show you how it's done, you would go to C drive, Nexon, DFO, image packs, and then locate in here Sprite, Monster, Gunner, RX-78. Now, other Gunner modifications are under Sprite, Character, Gunner, Effect. But since the RX-78 and most of the other mechanic skills are considered their own separate entities, they get a Sprite_Monster designation. And they're all right here under Sprite, Monster, Gunner. That's where both the Gunner and female Gunner sprites are located. We're going to be modifying RX-78. A little shout out for all the Gundam fans out there. Now, here we see the cute little robot as he's always been done. You know him, you love him. Maybe you don't if you PvP. But anyhow, what's important to notice is the number of frames in the animation. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now the two that we're going to be editing presently are RX-78 Walk and RX-78 Boom, because those are the only two things you'll see in normal gameplay most of the time. You can also edit the drop if you like, but what that's actually going to do is take your first frame of drop here and just paste that right into where this goes. So anything that we use as the first frame of drop is what it's going to show up in game inside this little red spot right here. But we're not going to be working on that today. We're just going to work on, if you summon the Landrunner, how it would walk and how it would blow up. So our first step in any sprite mod is to take the original, select the image you're looking at, and save all on both of these. Now, that will bring up a new folder in your NPK extractions. Here we are, Monster, Gunner, RX-78. Now, I've got a couple of folders already set up for the Mettool version, but inside each of these we want to study how many frames it takes and how it's going to move and behave. We see that it takes 1 frame of ducking, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames to reach its full downed position. So we're going to mimic that as best we can using the Mettool sprites that we've got here. Now, I've already decided upon which ones I'm going to do, and I've already cut them out. But just to show you how it's done, you're going to want to take this rectangular select and then select only the pixels you want. Control-C to copy. Control-N for new. It'll already put its dimensions in the same dimensions as this box you just carved out here. Photoshop does it a little bit differently. Photoshop will trim down to the exact pixel size of the image, but paint.net takes the size of the box. Like so. Make that a little bit bigger so you can see this is the exact same dimensions of our selection. Now, white space takes up some space on your computer, but it's not necessary to completely remove it if you don't want to. Everything that we're doing will work just fine if there's a little bit of white space, so don't worry about it. And you want to do that for each frame. Whoops. Got to reselect the marquee tool every time you do that, otherwise it'll just move what you previously selected. Might want to Control Z just to make sure that that's as it was. And you want to select what you got. Now, I got a little bit of this guy's toe, accidentally. So I'm going to hold down Alt. See there's a little minus next to the cursor there? And draw a box over what I don't want to select. And then copy, new, paste. And there's our second frame. Now these are not the actual frames that I'm going to be using. These were just for demonstration. If you want, you can save them wherever you're going to put your sprites. NPK Extractions, Gunner, Metool Boom. I've already got the sprites lined up. It's like a kitchen show. I've already got something cooking in the oven. But for now, we're not going to save these. And this will be left as is until later in the tutorial. For now, as you can see, I've got Metool Boom. But you'll notice that it just is sort of centered at the moment. That's not what you want it to look like in game. No. What we want it to look like is him jumping forward and landing slightly in front of where he was. The walk is a bit of a different story. You basically want that centered. But DFO doesn't do centering very easily, as you'll soon see. First step is to locate the walk animation. Note that it's the same number of frames as here. And just like in the previous video, we're going to replace in 32 bits all resources, NPK Extractions, Gunner, Metool Walk. Enter. Now it's been replaced. But you notice the walk animation is a little bit jagged. And that's because of these numbers you see off to the right here, right next to this coordinates indicator. Now that is what DFO is going to look to when it wants to put the sprite somewhere on screen. Now you'll notice if we uncheck actual coordinates, it doesn't run it quite right. This is a better indication of how it's going to move and how it's going to look on screen. That's another thing that you need to take into account, because if you were looking, let me undo that for a sec, back up here, this is where the sprite is situated. And that right here at the bottom, where the sprite's feet touch, that's where you're going to want your Metool's feet to touch. You'll notice that it is significantly above that, because it's a smaller sprite. And you want to modify the coordinates in such a way that they match. And the first step to understanding that is knowing how DFO registers sprite coordinates. The origin point of the DFO grid is right here in the upper left-hand corner. That's 0, 0. If you go to the right, the x coordinate gets higher. If you go down, the y coordinate gets higher. So let's look at what happens if I go to Modify Texture Coordinates on frame 0 of Metool Walk. Say I want to change the y coordinate to 57 and the x coordinate to 43. You'll notice that up moves it down and to the right. Increasing the numbers moves the sprite down and to the right. Now that looks a little bit closer to where we wanted him to be to match the RX78 from the original file, but it's not quite right. Anyways, that's not what we want to look at first. That's actually the last step of the process. The first step of the process is making it so that these little guys here look like they're walking all as part of a fluid motion. Now you can tell already, since my sprite modification there, that these are not at all smooth. They are choppy, very choppy. And in order to make them look good, you're basically going to have to use a lot of trial and error. There's really no quick way to do it unless you're lucky enough to have a sprite map that comes already positioned. Now, I don't have an example of that in this video, but I will be doing another video showing how much easier it is to do this if you have a sprite that's already been positioned, especially if you have Photoshop. Anyhow, what we want to do is try and modify these things so that they look right. The first step that I like to take, especially on a sprite that basically looks good centered, as we already saw from running through it in the Windows photo viewer, you'll want to make all of the sprites the same coordinate. Now that's not technically centering because, as I said, it uses the upper left corner as its origin point. So it's not going to stick them in the center as Windows Media Viewer does. It will stick them so that all of them are anchored to the upper left corner of their sprite. That's how it works. I personally think it would have been much smarter if they had used the normal Cartesian coordinate plane, which is x, y, 0 being in the bottom left corner, because obviously feet are on the bottom, and you're going to want feet to always be situated at the base of the sprite. But the DFO designers, or the DNF designers, Neopol, thought that was a bad idea for some God knows why reason. It makes our life hell, but maybe it was easier for them. For now, go here, back before, and modify texture coordinates. Now, in order to make them all the same coordinate, we're going to check this Modify All Resources tab, just like when we were replacing all the files in the folder. Notice that you can modify them all to have the same Y coordinate only by unchecking the X box, or the same X coordinate only by unchecking the Y box. For now, we want to move them all to the same place, period. So we leave both of them checked. Forget these over here. This is nothing. Don't bother with these. Just modify all the resources and hit Identified. Now you notice all of these numbers became the same number, the one that we input, 4357. And if you hit Animation, you can see that it's still a little bit choppy. And there's really no solution to this other than to simply mess with it until it looks right. And you have to have an eye for animations to do that. Sometimes it takes me hours. Sometimes it takes me a few minutes. This guy, when I first did him, miraculously turned out pretty well the first time. And I've actually saved those coordinates right over here so that I could refer to them for this video. This is the walk animation, which is what we're working on. So we're going to want to modify these to look like that, which we have to do one by one, which is 20, 61. Enter, enter. And we do that for each one. Again, I specifically chose a small edit so that this tedious effort wouldn't take very long and I'd be able to continue talking to you without requiring any video editing. Not to mention, it's a good demonstration of exactly how tedious some sprite mods can be. Anyways, now when we check that, you'll notice he looks a lot better. Maybe not perfect, mostly because I messed up here. And that's supposed to be a 21. 61, 60, 61, 62, 61, 60. Alright, a little bit of a waddle. That's how he looks. Now, it's not perfect, but as I say, you're never going to be able to get it perfect unless you spend a lot of time doing it. And in-game, it gives him that sort of robotic jiggle that makes it seem like he's not really alive, which I thought looked good, so I left it that way, a little bit bumpy. Next thing we're going to be editing is the boom. We start out the same way. We, replace 32, all resources, and locate the folder. Once you've got the directory selected, Metul Boom, you replace them all with the files you chose earlier. Now you'll notice that this one is even worse than before. He doesn't look like he's jumping at all. So once again, we're going to modify all the coordinates to the same starting point. That way we can modify them off of each other instead of off of where it's going. Now, you'll notice this looks pretty smooth, so you'll be able to modify it pretty easily from there. And what you're going to want to do is make this little guy sort of jump as he's going from bit to bit so that he lands a few feet in front of him and then slides to a halt. But he's not doing anything like that at the moment. In order to do that, we're going to want to modify this guy so that he's a little bit up and a little bit to the right. Now, this is where the next part of modifying coordinates comes into play. We're going to check this little box here, which says that modified coordinates are relative values. Now, you'll notice that resets this to a 0, 0. That means that we have not modified this beyond the point that it is presently at. If we were to put in x coordinate 5, y coordinate 10, what this is going to do is push the sprite 5 to the right and 10 down in relation to where it was before. If this box is unchecked, you have to put in the exact coordinate number that you want it to be at. Say 50, 50 is somewhere right around here. But we don't want to do that. We want to modify it from where it is. Move it a little bit to the right and a little bit up. So call it 10 to the right and 10 up. Now you'll remember before that the origin point is the upper left, so we're going to have to put a negative 10 in order to move the sprite in an upward direction. We're only modifying this sprite. Now you'll see he's up here. So we're a little bit further along in the discussion. Now this guy is still back at his base point, so we're going to want to modify him to look like this guy first and then work from there. He is at 16.9. So we put him at exactly 16.9 so that he's up there where we can see him. Now you'll notice, oops, that was actually a 19. My bad. You see how complicated this can be. Now you see, we want to move this guy a little bit to the right and a little bit down. So same as before, relative coordinates, a little bit to the right and back down to a little bit above ground level. Now, that is a very annoying error, which is telling you that if you try in backspace, if you have a numeral sitting there and you try and erase all of them, it will automatically put the coordinate as 0 because you can't have a blank space. It's an element of the extractor that is extremely annoying and one of the most common errors when trying to modify sprite coordinates quickly. But anyway, that doesn't make us much trouble. What we're going to do is move it down, back towards the ground by 7 pixels. So that it's almost counteracted what we did up here, but he's still technically in the air, where he will then land right here. So we're going to move him 25 to the right this time and not mess with the y coordinate at all. Now you can see he's sort of on the ground, leaping, falling, sitting, and then we do the same thing with these two down here, putting him at the same place as at frame number 3, 31:29. There. Now let's see what it looks like. He jumps, he ducks, he gets back in there. Now that still looks a little bit choppy because that was a really rushed job, and in all honesty, it takes a lot more work than that, and you're going to have to modify the effect, open up the game, see if it looks right, close the game, and then make small changes until it looks to your liking. And that's where the lion's share of sprite work actually happens. What happens in Photoshop or Paint.net and what happens in the extractor is nothing compared to the amount of work you'll be doing simply messing with the textures over and over and over again. So be prepared for that if you decide to get into modifying your own sprites. Now, as before, I've got the boom already set up over here with the coordinates that I had from before so that I can put them in. The next step in the process, after modifying the coordinates so that the animation itself looks smooth, is putting the sprite in the proper position on the screen so that it doesn't look like it's floating in midair or somewhere completely outside of its hitbox when you actually get in game. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the term, a hitbox is the invisible area surrounding a sprite where if that comes into contact with another sprite's hitbox, it will cause what is called a collision detection, which will allow the game to recognize that the two sprites have overlapped, or the invisible box around them has overlapped, and indicate what it should do from there. If, say, the hitbox for Ghost Slash comes into contact with the hitbox for Average Slayer, then it will register a hit, and the Average Slayer will be knocked back. Now, if the hitbox doesn't align with the sprite, then you get what's called phantom range, which is where you cannot see the sprites overlap because their hitboxes are awry, but the attack animation or the attack effect will still happen regardless of whether the sprites actually overlapped or not. So the principal goal in any sprite modification is to get the animations to match the coordinates of the original sprite as closely as possible so as to minimize the phantom range caused by us making the sprite, in this case, so much smaller than it was. Now you can see how I've made it so that he sort of shrinks down a little bit as he's going. Now, you wouldn't think that that looks smooth just looking at it. It looks kind of weird. Why is his hat sinking? But in-game, the way the Landrunner animation, which is now a Metool, plays out, is that he sort of hops forward and then jiggles a bit before exploding. And that's what I was trying to capture here. Anyhow, now we've got the walk and the explosion hop in place. And with that in place, and looking smooth, the next step is, as I said, to put it in the right place. Now, these coordinates that I had over here already are in the right place, but let's move them somewhere else. This time, we're modifying all the resources relatively, whereas before, when I didn't have the relative checkbox checked, it changed all of these numbers here to the exact numbers we had here. But the beauty of the relative values box is that we can move 50 pixels to the right, 20 pixels down, and it will move each of those relative to each of their previous coordinate maps. You'll notice how each of them is no longer exactly the same as the others, but rather modified based on where they used to be. The animation still plays out exactly the same way relative to itself, but the whole thing has been moved to a different location. And we're going to use that as our favorite tool for putting a sprite in the place of the old sprite. Now, here this RX78, which actually contains all of these animations pieced together into one file, will be our sort of guideline for where we're going to want the sprite to be. Now, if you don't have the actual coordinates box checked, then you'll notice that everything is in the upper left-hand corner, and you'll never be able to tell where anything is relative to anything else. So you absolutely must have actual coordinates checked when determining where to place your sprites. Now, we just moved this guy, but we already know where he's supposed to be, which is a little bit cheating. Generally, a good rule of thumb is to take the first frame of any animation and sort of use that as a guideline. Now, again, we want this line at his feet to be where the Metool's feet line up. See this little line under his foot there, the one that's technically touching the ground? So what we're going to do is modify the texture coordinates, all of them relatively, left a few. Let's make it somewhere that I don't know what it is. Minus 40 and minus 10 to counteract what we did before. Now sort of flip up and down, and you can see that he's still a little bit off. So we make a minor modification until he looks right. Let's do 10 more pixels. Now we see the two line up pretty much as they're supposed to. Not exactly, but pretty much, because this is technically him in the start of his jump forward, and he only has 3 frames to get from the ground up and back down to where he was going. So it's important to sort of know what sprite you're looking at and think about how far it has to move before you do any animation. Where do you want it to start and where do you want it to end up? In this case, we want the walk and this to line up almost exactly. And it basically does. But for our purposes with the boom, it actually has to line up with this bit right here, number 6, which is somewhat lower. Anyways, our work is actually done here for now. And as I said before in Chapter 1, you no longer have to modify these numbers up here. If they're red, you don't have to worry about it. If they're blue, you don't have to worry about it. We're just going to add a 2 to the end of this NPK up here and make it work. But as it so happens, we have managed to keep the size under restrictions in the case of the file that we've modified here. This sprite is smaller than the original. So the Dnf Extractor, if you click on the blue numbers there, it will ask if you want to fill it to the correct size of the file, which is to say this number on the right, which is what it was originally and what DFO recognizes as the correct file size. We're going to hit yes, and now it just sort of fills it up with blank space. So the DFO will think it's bigger than it actually is. Now, in the case that you're fortunate enough to have this happen, you don't have to rename anything. You can just leave it the same name it is. But in the case that Nexon decides to patch the game so that it no longer recognizes this 151835 as the correct number of bytes in the file, then you're going to kick yourself wishing you had just renamed it in the first place. So we're going to use the 2 method anyway, just because it eliminates future work. And if I had personally done this with all of my mods from the beginning, I wouldn't have had to update anything, which is just, it sounds magical to me. I wish I had known. But I didn't, but you do. So learn from my mistakes. Anyways, that brings to a close Chapter 2 of my DFO sprite editing tutorial video series. And I hope to see you again next time, where we will discuss modifying an existing sprite modification from either a foreign entity or somebody else from a previous version of DFO and making it work with the current patch of DFO. So look forward to that.